December 20th, 1943, Ortona, Italy. 9 o'clock hours. The Adriatic Sea is a cold, churning gray, but inside the narrow streets of the medieval port town, the air is thick with the white powder of pulverized limestone. A soldier of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment leans against a shattered doorframe, his breath hitching in the freezing air. He hears a sound, the clink of a mess tin against stone. It's coming from the floor above, through a hole blown in the ceiling by APIAT mortar. He doesn't see a face. He only sees the distinctive rimless M38 helmet and the flash of a jump smock. Before he can raise his rifle, a stick grenade tumbles through the gap. In the split second before the blast, he realizes he is not fighting a regular conscript. He is fighting a man who has been dropped from the sky into the fires of Russia and the dust of Africa. These are the men of the 3rd Regiment, 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. In this claustrophobic hell of collapsing walls, the German paratrooper is no longer just a soldier. He's becoming a myth. The world had seen them leap over the Netherlands and seize Crete from the clouds, but here, pinned between the mountains and the sea, they would find a new, darker purpose. This is the moment the world learned to fear the Green Devils. By late 1943, the Allied soft underbelly of Europe had proven to be a thick leather hide of mountainous terrain and reinforced concrete. The invasion of Italy, which Winston Churchill hoped would knock the Axis out of the war in a single blow, had devolved into a grueling vertical war of attrition. The German High Command, led by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had constructed a series of formidable defensive lines across the narrow Italian peninsula. The most daunting of these was the Gustav Line, a belt of fortifications anchored by the heights of Monte Cassino in the west and the coastal town of Ortona in the east. Ortona was a strategic prize out of proportion to its size. It was one of the few deep-water ports on the Adriatic coast. For the British 8th Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, capturing Ortona was the key to turning the German flank. They could utilize its harbor to shorten their overextended supply lines and push toward Pescara and eventually Rome. The task was handed to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade. The Canadians were fresh, motivated, and battle-hardened from the Sicilian campaign, but they were about to walk into a tactical nightmare that no manual could have prepared them for. The terrain leading to Ortona was a series of deep ridges and ravines, known as the Gully, which acted as natural tank traps. The German forces had spent weeks preparing the ground, blowing up bridges and mining every approach. However, it wasn't just the geography that favored the defenders. It was the quality of the men standing in the way. While other German units were beginning to show the strain of years of combat, the unit tasked with holding Ortona was at the peak of its lethal efficiency. They were the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. Hitler's elite fire brigade rushed from the plains of Russia to the Italian coast with a single order: do not retreat. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division was not a typical military formation. Formed in 1938, they were the Warburg elite, having carried out the world's first large-scale airborne operations. However, after the Pyrrhic victory at Crete in 1941, where their losses were so severe that Hitler forbade further major jumps, the division had been transformed into elite ground infantry. They had spent the intervening years as a fire brigade on the Eastern Front, plugged into the most desperate gaps in the line to halt Soviet breakthroughs. By the time they arrived in the Adriatic sector of Italy in December 1943, they were a collection of battle-hardened veterans who had mastered the art of the defensive stand. Hitler's directive for Ortona was explicit and brutal. The fortress must be held to the last man. Unlike the open-field battles of North Africa or the rolling hills of Sicily, Ortona offered the Fallschirmjäger a different kind of canvas. The town was a dense cluster of stone houses, narrow alleys, and ancient catacombs. Recognizing that the Canadian tanks would dominate the streets, the German paratroopers didn't just man the buildings. They re-engineered the town. They blew up entire houses to create piles of rubble that funneled Allied tanks into kill zones, and they tunneled through interior walls to create hidden passages. The stage was set for a collision between two of the finest infantry forces in the world. The Canadians, representing the industrial might and fresh resolve of the Allies, were moving against a German unit that had come to define itself through its tenacity and refusal to yield. As the first Canadian patrols entered the outskirts of the town on December 20th, they found the streets eerily silent. The Fallschirmjäger were not on the balconies or in the gardens. They were deep inside the stone, waiting for the battle to become intimate. The coming week would see the birth of a new kind of urban warfare, where the distinction between a room and a battlefield vanished entirely. The defense of Ortona is defined by the tactical angle of mouse-holing and the technological angle of specialized paratrooper armament. In the winter of 1943, the Fallschirmjäger realized that the streets of Ortona were death traps. Anyone caught in the open would be shredded by Canadian machine gun fire. To counter this, they stayed off the streets entirely. They used explosive charges to blast holes through the interior walls of row houses, allowing them to move from building to building without ever stepping outside. This was the birth of mouse-holing. It turned the town into a giant, interconnected hive. A German squad could engage a Canadian patrol from one house, disappear through a hole in the wall, and reappear 3 houses down to fire again before the dust had even settled. From the technological angle, the paratroopers were equipped with weaponry specifically designed for their unique role. While the standard German infantrymen relied on the bolt-action car 98K, many of the Fallschirmjäger at Ortona carried the FG-42, Fallschirmjäger 42. This revolutionary weapon was a hybrid of a light machine gun and an automatic rifle, capable of delivering devastating firepower in the cramped confines of a hallway. Combined with their extensive use of the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, the German paratroopers possessed a higher ratio of automatic weapons and anti-tank capability per man than almost any other unit in the war. This technological edge, paired with their tactical ingenuity, meant that even a single squad could hold an entire city block against a company of attackers. The struggle for Ortona also reveals the human angle of the Green Devils and the moral angle of a battle without mercy. The nickname Green Devils, Grünteufel, was not a German invention. It was a title bestowed upon them by Allied soldiers who were stunned by their resilience. These men were indoctrinated with the 10 Commandments of the Fallschirmjäger, a code that emphasized total self-reliance and the belief that the paratrooper must seek out combat. At Ortona, this manifested as a chilling psychological presence. They were known to stay in positions until they were literally buried by rubble, only to crawl out and continue firing. This fanaticism created an aura of invincibility that weighed heavily on the Canadian psyche, transforming every doorway into a potential grave. From the moral angle, Ortona represented a descent into a primal form of warfare where the rules of engagement vanished. Because the fighting was so close, often with enemies, separated only by a single floor or a thin lath and plaster wall, it became impossible to distinguish between combatants and the civilians who remained huddled in the cellars. The German paratroopers, committed to the fortress order, showed a ruthless disregard for the town's architectural or human cost. They booby-trapped everything: sewing machines, abandoned toys, and even the bodies of the fallen. This lack of battlefield etiquette forced the Canadians to adopt a similarly brutal stance. It was no longer a war of liberation. It was a war of extermination in a stone graveyard. This combination of elite training and moral detachment made the 1st Fallschirmjäger the most feared unit on the Italian front. They were not merely defending a line. They were defending their identity as the Third Reich's ultimate warriors. By the time the battle reached its peak, the Canadians realized they weren't just fighting for a port, they were fighting to see if the Green Devils could actually be killed. The battle reached its fever pitch on December 24, 1943, Christmas Eve. In any other theater, there might have been a silent night, but in Ortona, the darkness was shattered by the roar of collapsing masonry. The Canadians had reached the heart of the town, the Piazza San Tommaso, where the ancient cathedral stood as a jagged skeleton. Here, the Fallschirmjäger had prepared their most gruesome trap. They had wired a large apartment building with tons of explosives. As a platoon of the 2nd Canadian Brigade moved in to clear the structure, the German paratroopers waited until the Canadians reached the upper floors before triggering the demolition. The building disintegrated, burying 24 men alive. Only one survived the dust and the weight of the stone. The Canadians retaliated with a terrifying symmetry. They located a building held by a significant force of Fallschirmjäger and used their own demolition teams to bring the entire structure down on the German heads. This was no longer a battle of rifles. It was a battle of gravity and high explosives. The Green Devils refused to yield the piazza, turning the rubble of the cathedral into a fortress of machine gun nests. From the bell towers and cellar gratings, they poured a continuous stream of fire that stalled the Canadian armor. The tanks were useless. The narrow streets were choked with debris, and the German paratroopers used the elevation of the ruins to fire Panzerfaust down onto the thin top armor of the Shermans. They had no hope of reinforcement, and their supply lines were under constant Allied shelling, yet they maintained a rigid defensive perimeter. Every room was a battlefield. Every staircase was a trench. The very concept of a front line had ceased to exist, replaced by a 360-degree theater of sudden violent death. As the sun rose on Christmas Day, a haunting scene unfolded. In the basement of the Church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli, Canadian soldiers sang hymns while the thunder of German 88mm shells shook the icons off the walls. Just hundreds of yards away, the Fallschirmjäger were eating cold rations in the ruins, their faces blackened by soot. Clutching their FG-42s, the Green Devils had been reduced to small, autonomous combat groups, Kampftruppen, yet their coordination remained uncanny. At 11 a.m., the Germans launched a counterattack through the sewers and catacombs, emerging behind the Canadian lines near the town square. It was a desperate, final attempt to break the Canadian momentum, leading to a bayonet struggle in the pitch-black corridors of the municipal buildings. The turning point came not from a single breakthrough, but from the sheer weight of Canadian persistence. The 2nd Brigade began using Honey tanks and 17-pounder anti-tank guns at point-blank range, literally sniping individual German snipers out of windows by collapsing entire facades. By December 27th, the German commander, Lieutenant General Richard Heydrich, looked at his casualty reports. His 3rd Regiment had been bled white. The paratroopers were exhausted, many having gone 5 days without sleep. Sustained only by the frantic adrenaline of the Mousehole War, the town was no longer a defensible position. It was a charnel house that had served its purpose of delaying the 8th Army for a critical week. They did not retreat in panic, following the same disciplined procedures that had made them famous. They booby-trapped their abandoned positions one last time, setting timers on massive demolition charges to ensure that even their departure would claim Allied lives. When Canadian patrols cautiously moved into the town center on the morning of the 28th, they found only the dead and the smell of cordite. The Green Devils had vanished into the mountain mist to the north. The silence that fell over Ortona on December 29, 1943, was as heavy as the rubble that choked its streets. For the Canadian forces, the victory was bittersweet, a triumph of the spirit that had cost them over 2,300 casualties, including 500 dead. The Stalingrad of the South had been won, but the strategic prize had turned to ash. The port, which was supposed to fuel the Allied drive toward Rome, was so thoroughly demolished by German sabotage and Allied shelling that it would take months to become operational. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade had broken the Green Devils, but they had been so depleted in the process that their offensive momentum was shattered. For the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, the aftermath of Ortona was the final step in their evolution from elite paratroopers to the most feared defensive infantry on the planet. They had lost nearly a third of their strength, but they had achieved Hitler's primary goal. They had traded space for time. By holding a single town for 8 days, they allowed Kesselring to solidify the Gustav Line defenses further inland. The reports that reached Allied intelligence were grim. They described an enemy that did not surrender even when surrounded, an enemy that used inhumane levels of booby traps, and an enemy that could turn a pile of bricks into a fortress in minutes. The psychological shadow of the Green Devils now loomed over every future Allied operation in Italy. The battle also marked a shift in German propaganda. The Fallschirmjäger were hailed as the Watchmen of the South. Their performance at Ortona was used to bolster the morale of a retreating Wehrmacht, proving that even against the industrial superiority of the Western Allies, a determined elite unit could still dictate the terms of a battle. However, the cost of this reputation was the total destruction of the town and its people. Of the 10,000 civilians who lived in Ortona, over 1,300 were killed in the crossfire or by German executions. The aftermath was not just a military tally. It was a civilian catastrophe that left the Pearl of the Adriatic a scarred graveyard, a testament to the price of being forged by the most feared unit of the war. The legacy of Ortona fundamentally reshaped Allied military doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century. The sheer difficulty of dislodging the Fallschirmjäger from the town's ruins led to the rewriting of urban warfare manuals. Allied commanders realized that total destruction from the air or via artillery was often counterproductive. By turning buildings into piles of rubble, they were inadvertently creating the perfect defensive terrain for elite light infantry. This lesson was applied with varying degrees of success to later battles in Europe, from the liberation of French villages to the final, desperate street fighting in the heart of the Third Reich. For the Green Devils themselves, Ortona was merely the opening act of their most famous stand. The survivors of the 3rd Regiment were pulled back to the mountains, where they were integrated into the defenses of Monte Cassino. It was there, amidst the ruins of the ancient Benedictine monastery, that the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division would truly cement their status as the most stubborn obstacle in the path of the Allied armies. They applied the mouse-holing and rubble defense techniques they perfected in Ortona to hold back 4 major Allied offensives over 5 months. The Ortona method became the standard for German defensive operations throughout the Italian campaign. Strategically, the battle proved that the soft underbelly of Europe was a myth. The tenacity of the paratroopers forced the Allies to commit more divisions and resources to the Italian theater than originally planned, diverting strength that could have been used for the upcoming invasion of Normandy. The Green Devils had succeeded in turning Italy into a meat grinder. They would continue to fight as a disciplined unit until the final surrender in May 1945. Having never been fully rooted in the field, they remained, in the eyes of their Canadian and British adversaries, the most formidable infantrymen they had ever faced, soldiers forged in the stone and blood of a small Adriatic port. The rubble of Ortona has long since been cleared, and the Adriatic sun now warms a rebuilt town where the scars of 1943 are hidden beneath fresh coats of plaster. Yet in the annals of military history, the name Ortona remains synonymous with a specific brand of nightmare. It stands as a reminder that the most formidable weapon in any arsenal is not the tank or the bomber, but the human will when it is channeled through elite training and a refusal to accept defeat. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division entered the town as elite soldiers. They left as the Green Devils, a title forged in the heat of a house-to-house struggle that defied every convention of modern war. This battlefield proved that technology has its limits. In the narrow mouse holes and dark cellars, the industrial superiority of the Allies was neutralized by the raw, intimate violence of the paratroopers' knife and grenade. It was a victory of the primitive over the mechanical, a return to a form of combat that had not been seen since the siege warfare of the Middle Ages. For the Canadians who fought there, the memory of the Green Devils was one of respect mingled with horror or recognition that they had faced the very pinnacle of the German military machine. Ultimately, Ortona teaches us that a unit is not just made of men and equipment, but of the terrain it is forced to hold. The town and the paratroopers became one entity, a stone monster that swallowed lives and spat out legends. As we look back on the Stalingrad of the South, we see more than just a battle. We see the birth of the modern commando spirit and the grim reality of what happens when the most feared units of the war are given a piece of ground they are told they can never leave. The Green Devils did not save the Third Reich, but they ensured that the road to its end would be paved with a level of resistance the world would never forget. The ghost in the limestone. The dust never truly settled. For Hans, a veteran of the 3rd Regiment, the war didn't end with a surrender. It ended every time he closed his eyes and smelled pulverized stone. He remembered the Christmas of '43 not by the carols, but by the vibration of the floorboards beneath his boots, the rhythmic thud of Canadian artillery that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. He had lived in a mousehole for 7 days, a king of a 3-foot kingdom of brick and shadows. He remembered the face of a Canadian boy he had surprised in a Kitchener boy who looked more like a baker than a soldier. They had stared at each other for a heartbeat, two ghosts caught in a stone trap, before the instincts of the Green Devil took over. Hans survived Ortona, but a part of him remained there, buried under the Piazza San Tommaso. He was Warburn, now, a man who could no longer sleep in a room without checking the ceiling for holes, forever listening for the clink of a mess tin in the silence of the night.